We are currently housed in the offices of INACS, the Institute for Neuroscience and Consciousness Studies. We're grateful for them donating their space for us to store the 3,500 plus books that we have on UFOs, consciousness, parapsychology, UFOs, remote viewing, near-death experiences, all kinds of anomalous phenomena. And membership is $20 a year. We're supported by donations and the generosity of folks like yourselves. It's what helps us have these free events. I'll be passing around a donation jug later. The INACS group that I mentioned earlier, I also want to let y'all know, recently won the Workhollier Prize awarded by the International Remote Viewing Association at their national conference. The Workhollier Prize is named after Rene Workhollier, who remote viewer Joseph McMoneagle said, if you want to refer to the father of remote viewing, you would have to go back half a century to the French parapsychologist Rene Workhollier. And the Workhollier Award is awarded to people for best research, experimental design. And INACS, which I also serve on the board of, was awarded this because of a research project that they've got going on that is involving remote viewing and dowsing. So if you're interested in that, the sign-up sheet that's going around has applications for the Anomaly Archives. It also has a handout from the INACS Institute about if you're interested in becoming a volunteer subject in that parapsychological study involving remote viewing and dowsing. Nick Redfern is our guest tonight, and he has authored well over a dozen books on a variety of Fortean topics, ranging from cryptozoology books dealing with werewolves, lake monsters, Bigfoot, and chupacabras and other sundry creatures. He's also documented many different documents uncovered through the Freedom of Information Act related to UFOs, the contactees, other aspects of our weird world. And some of those books have included Keep Out, Top Secret Places Governments Don't Want You to Know About, The Real Men in Black, Final Events in the Secret Government Group on Demonic UFOs and the Afterlife. That's another really interesting one. And of course, you probably saw him a couple years ago when we had him speak on Contactees, a history of alien-human interaction. So tonight he's going to be talking about pyramids in the Pentagon and the world's weirdest places. I'm going to start with a brief video, some of that's going viral right now that you may have seen. That's got some interesting shots of the pyramids, and we'll lead into that with Nick. So thank you for coming. Welcome.
Thanks everybody. As Miles said, I'm going to be talking about two subjects tonight.
Record.
Oh yeah, do we want? Yeah. And one is the pyramids, mysteries of the pyramids, and what the Pentagon and the government knows about the subject. And just sort of coincidentally, which is sort of even a bit of a mystery to me, the publishers put out another book from me, which wasn't supposed to come out till next year, and they put it out like 8 weeks after the pyramids book. So it's I've kind of got two on the go, which so confuses me as the author, never mind the people who buy the books as well. So I thought I'd kind of sort of split it into two 45-minute segments. The first one on the pyramids, and you know, the book itself kind of delves into the whole ancient astronauts scenario as it relates to the pyramid. You know, the idea that were we visited in thousands of years ago by extraterrestrials, and were they responsible for some of the legends, folklore, myths, stories, beliefs relative to religion of the gods coming down from the skies and things like this. Now, of course, a lot of books have been written on this subject, you know, going back to like the days of ERICH von Däniken, through Zechariah Sitchin, people like that. And although I've always had an interest in this area, I've never written anything about it, because it's like, well, you know, there's a lot of good people doing solid research in these fields already. You know, why just go along and just do something that's going to replicate and copy what somebody else has done? So I've kind of steered away from it. But as I said, not through lack of interest or belief that, you know, it's worth looking into, just that, as I said, a lot of good work was already being done in that field. But one of the things that kept cropping up now and again, where I'd find a little bit of snippets of data here and there, was sort of references to secret official interest in things like the pyramids, the story of Noah's Ark, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and things like this. And more I dug into it, the more and more leads I found, to where eventually I thought, well, you know, this is sort of telling a story that basically covers, if you look at the way the government investigates UFOs today, it's kind of like the equivalent of that, but having an entire project that looked into sort of mystical relics, ancient artifacts, lost civilizations, and ancient astronauts. And as I said, the more I dug into it, the more I found evidence of these sort of projects and sub-projects within sub-projects inside the Pentagon and other agencies, where they've compiled massive amounts of information on places like the pyramids. And so that's basically what led me to sort of do the research and finally write the book. And it sounds a bizarre subject, you know. You imagine the Pentagon spending significant dollar amounts to try and figure out how the pyramids were built. You know, you imagine that's sort of not necessarily the official mandate of the government, you know, to spend your tax dollars on, but nevertheless they were looking into it. And of course, one of the main reasons, as you can probably guess, was that when they were looking at some of these ancient artifacts with so-called magical or supernatural powers, it was, well, can we understand the technology and weaponize it for the present day, if you like? That was sort of the basic scenario. But the one area they focused on more than any other, hence the title of the book, The Pyramids of the Pentagon, was the Pyramids of Egypt. Now, the reason why they were digging into this area, I was actually quite surprised to get hold of files through the Freedom of Information Act on this very area, was they were trying to determine if the legends about the pyramids and a lot of other ancient structures around the world, were they built via some sort of anti-gravity or levitation type technology. Now, whether or not that's true, you know, the fact of the matter is that is what the Pentagon was looking at, because if you go back throughout history to whether it's ancient Egypt, Stonehenge in England, the huge structures in Central America, Mexico, South America, they all have legends about these huge, gigantic, sort of multi-ton stones being moved by, back then, you know, sort of magical means. They would talk about the stones being floated into the sky and just sort of gently pushed into place. Now, of course, today that probably sounds like the closest thing we could imagine to levitation. Now, you know, if we look at the pyramids in Egypt, you know, those stones, people don't realise, you know, the sheer scale of how big, you know, the pyramids are. You know, we're talking sort of, you know, a base of like 600 feet, height 400, multi-tons, you know. Some of those stones weigh like 20 tons, you know, and they're sort of 400 feet up in the air, you know, and a lot of studies have been done. People talk about rollers and ropes and pulleys you know, to move the stones and put them in place. But, you know, a 20-ton stone, you know, dragging it or pulling it 400 feet in the air, you know, when you look at the logistics of it like that, it's sort of a pretty tough thing to do. And a lot of these stones were actually quarried several hundred miles from where the pyramids were built, or are built. That's what a lot of people don't realise. It's not like they just dug the stone out from, you know, 100 yards away and just pulled it across. We're literally talking 500 miles distance. So not only are they reportedly using just manpower, ropes and pulleys to lift the stones into place, first they've got to drag each and every single one of those 20 to 80 ton stones 500 miles, then lift them into place. And you look at how many are on just that one pyramid there. That's actually not even the Great Pyramid, you know, which is even bigger. So, you know, you have a lot of logistics to think about. And people say, well, you know, they rolled them along on you know, tree trunks, just chopped tree trunks down and rolled them along like that. Well, that's fine, I guess, to an extent, if you're doing it on like a nice tarmacked road, you know, 3-lane highway. We're talking about the desert, you know, dragging it across sand. You know, it's like, imagine you go to, I don't know, down by Beaumont or somewhere, you know, Galveston, and you try and get a 20-ton rock and a few tree trunks and try and push it along, you know, see how far you get. If you get 500 miles, you know, I'd be amazed. And then if you could raise it 400 feet in the air, I'd be even more amazed. But if you actually look back into the original Egyptian legends, they all talk, this sounds strange what I'm going to say first, but the Egyptians, the British with Stonehenge, Central America, the Maya, the Inca, they all talk about the stones being raised by what they call magical music, or like supernatural tunes, or to the sound of a musical instrument. And what they're actually talking about in modern day technology is what's known as acoustic levitation, which is kind of like it's a bit difficult to explain it, but it's where you have what are called sort of acoustic sound waves which can be directed against each other. Kind of, you know, imagine like a magnet when it pushes against each other. You can't push it together, two opposite poles. It's kind of like that, and between these sort of acoustic waves, if you like, is what's called the resonance zone. And there's been some success made in the labs with raising small objects in what's called this resonance zone. It's kind of like you have like a directed sound energy, and the military's actually been researching this quite a lot, to where they're now able to raise, you know, not heavy, large objects, but something like this size, weighing sort of 20 pounds, in these resonance zones. And it's all done via acoustics or sound. And if you look at the stories of the pyramids particularly, there was a 10th century writer named Al-Masudi, and he wrote back then as to how he'd heard rumours and legends from even ancient texts and books and things like that, about how supposedly the Egyptians, when they built the pyramids, had these long rows of what he described as these mysterious iron rods. And almost like an alleyway of trees, but they were like these poorly described iron rods, and he said that the stones would sort of be pushed gently along these alleyways about this high off the ground, kind of like, you know, if you're pushing a little rowing boat in the water and it would just sail along of its own accord for like 15 feet, then you push it again. And he said that's how they moved the stones. From Stonehenge in England, there's a story about how supposedly somebody played a magic flute and the stones raised into the air. In the Mayan culture, they have stories about like the equivalent of an acoustic guitar being plucked and then the stones were raised up again. So, you know, we shouldn't take those stories literally, because a lot of them were sort of passed down orally over, in some cases, you know, 4 or 5 generations or 400 or 500 years. But if you sort of take away the simplistic, magical implication, you know, the folkloric distortion, all of them are talking about sound being used to raise stones. And of course the exact opposite is the idea of using it as a weapon. You know, if you look at the biblical story of the walls of Jericho being brought down by trumpets, you know, it's exactly the opposite. You know, instead of raising stones, you're using sound waves to actually destroy something. And again, that's something else that the military's working on now. It's like acoustic weapons for sort of crowd control. You know, it's like if in theory, you know, people are demonstrating about something, you know, they don't like all the cameras being put on the traffic lights or whatever, and somebody goes and complains about it, you know, there's a big demonstration in the local park. Well, the directed energy weapons or acoustic weapons, basically what they can do, imagine if you're like at a rock concert, you know, you can feel that thumping beat going through you. Well, directed sound waves can actually be used to sort of make you feel nauseous, sick, affect your nervous system, even make, you know, give you vertigo, dizziness, and basically disable you. And that's the point of these acoustic weapons. They're called non-lethal weapons, where, you know, the weapon would be pointed at you. You wouldn't see anything like a bullet or anything like that. It would just be you'd suddenly feel really ill and drop to your knees because you were being sort of bombarded by these concentrated sound waves. So that's sort of the other more disturbing angle of it, I guess. But I was sort of surprised to actually get files on this subject through the Freedom of Information Act. You know, it's one of these things you would think they wouldn't release this material, but they actually did. And it talks about how, going back to the 1950s, the Navy and the Pentagon were following the research of a man named Dr. Maurice Jessup. And Jessup was someone who was digging into a lot of interesting stuff back in the 50s. He was heavily into UFOs, but he was somebody who didn't just sort of write books from, you know, his office or whatever, or his study. He would actually go out into the field and investigate these things. And he spent a lot of time in Central America, Mexico, South America, and came back totally convinced that things like the equivalent of the Egyptian pyramids were built by extraterrestrials. He couldn't see any other way than some sort of anti-gravity or levitation to move these massive stones. You know, he came to believe that just brute force manpower and ropes and pulleys, you know, just couldn't do it. And so what he did was to go out there, get a bunch of photographs, and then write up his theories in his books. Well, what was interesting is that, you know, in addition to his regular readers who bought his books, the Navy took a great deal of interest in a book he published in 1957 called The Case for the UFO, which was basically a study of UFOs and these ancient structures. And what happened was that a copy of the book was mailed anonymously to the Navy, which had all these sort of annotations, handwritten annotations in there about the pyramids and all about secret naval experiments to try and make a warship invisible and all sorts of strange things. But when you read the annotated version, a lot of people think it focuses more on the stories about the military trying to make this warship invisible, which is actually a famous story known as the Philadelphia experiment. But the annotations actually focus more on the idea of using acoustic levitation to move stones. And the Navy, you know, instead of just ignoring it or just saying, well, that's interesting, they actually flew Jessup out to Washington, D.C. and put him up overnight, paid for his airfare and hotel room, etc., etc., and then interviewed him for like a full day on his theories about, you know, could these massive stones have been moved by some technology, you know, that could be applied today. And Jessup got sort of really concerned that, you know, here he was, some guy who was just writing books about the pyramids, and then he's being grilled in this room by two guys from naval intelligence. You know, it wasn't sort of the sort of thing you expect to see every day, I guess. And he got very sort of worried and paranoid by this whole situation, primarily because he thought, well, if the government's watching, then obviously hit on something that's real and significant and important to them. You know, that was his line of thinking or his conclusion. And so, you know, he began getting more and more paranoid, thinking people were watching him, and I guess the very fact that they'd flown him out to Washington, D.C. suggests they probably were watching him, you know. But in 1959, he confided one day in a colleague, Dr. Manson Valentine, that he'd made a major breakthrough in all this, and he was going to reveal it the next day. But on that particular day, he was actually found dead in his car in a Florida park. With sort of like a hose pipe, you know, going through from the exhaust and through the front window, and he, you know, dead from carbon monoxide poisoning. Now, people said, well, maybe he's depressed and paranoid and worried about all this stuff with the Navy, which he was. But on the other hand, you know, he'd made this exciting phone call only 24 hours earlier saying, I've got this major breakthrough, I want to tell you about it. And of course, we don't know what that was. Some of his files seem to be missing. You know, we don't have all of those. You know, just don't know where they went. So, you know, is it a case that somebody got rid of him because he was getting too close to the truth of this, you know, acoustic technology? we just don't know. I mean, that part of the story, I'll admit, is sort of a bit of a grey area. But in terms of the military actually looking at these ancient stories of things like the pyramids, that's absolutely true. You know, and it said the files, or at least some of them, are now in the public domain through the Pentagon. But again, you know, people say, well, why on earth would the Pentagon be interested? You know, it's not their job to sort of further our knowledge of archaeology or history. You know, that's for theologians and archaeologists and sort of Indiana Jones types, not agents of the government. So it's pretty clear that this sort of spin-off angle that they were looking at, you know, well, could we use the technology today? You know, could we use it on the battlefield? You know, if you imagine that you have some sort of anti-gravity aircraft that isn't going to require a runway to land, you know, isn't going to require massive amounts of fuel, but could just sort of hover, you know, land, take off, right and left-hand turns in a harsh environment, then that would be sort of a major thing. You know, it's like you take off from, I don't know, your nearest big airport, like DFW Airport. The only reason the huge runways are there is because the plane's got to get its speed up, you know. You imagine some craft that could just take off vertically, weighed a massive amounts, but wasn't sort of downweighed by gravity, you know, it could actually overcome gravity. Then you've really got a technological device that could basically dominate any country in the world. So that seems to be the reason why they were looking into all this, was the issue of sort of weaponizing the past for the present and the future, if you like. Which we probably shouldn't be surprised about if we're going to be cynical about things. So. But the more I dug into it, the more I found it wasn't just the pyramids and this acoustic levitation angle that government agencies were looking into. Probably the weirdest one of all, which also has like a religious biblical link, was the story of Noah's Ark. Now, you know, you think, why on earth would the Pentagon be looking for Noah's Ark? Well, it all goes back to 1949, when a US Air Force spy plane was flying across Turkey towards the border of the former Soviet Union. The Russians at the time were supposedly building a new military base somewhere near the border of Turkey, because Turkey being our friends, you know, it was kind of seen as a threat to the West. So this spy plane mission got permission to fly across Turkey towards the Soviet Union to try and get as many photographs as they could. Well, the guys used Mount Ararat, which is where, according to the Bible, that Noah's Ark came to rest. They used Mount Ararat as like a guiding line as to where to fly. As they approached the mountain, one of the people on board the plane, which was like a large bomber-type spy plane, not like a, you know, just a fighter plane with one pilot or whatever, he said he could see what looked like a large boat-like object sticking out the ice. Now, Mount Ararat's about 17,000 feet high. The top few thousand feet, every day of every month of every year, it's sort of permanently ice-capped and snow-capped. You know, the top of it is like the Himalayas or something like that, Everest. And he said he could see what looked like a 600-foot long wing sticking out of part of the ice. So quite naturally, they asked if they could get permission to photograph it. And of course, the guys at the base said, well, yeah, of course, photograph it. You want to know what it is. So they swung the plane around. In the middle of doing that, as the plane turned, one of the other pilots, or one of the other crew members on the other side, said he could see a similar type wing structure on a slightly adjacent face. So they photographed that as well, and both of these look like huge wings, both about 600 feet long. Now, of course, nobody today, or even back then, would be flying an aircraft with an overall wingspan of 1,200 feet. That's if they were wings, you know. They weren't talking about these things looking like ancient wooden boats. They looked to be like, they described as like slate-coloured dark wings that just penetrated out of the ice. They didn't just look like rock that had broken off. So they then carried on with the original mission to photograph this Russian base, returned to the base, to their home base I should say. The pictures were developed, sent to the Pentagon, and then vanished for years. And a few of them actually surface now again through the Freedom of Information Act, and they show what looks like some sort of weird object, sort of semi-buried in the ice. Now, the Pentagon and both the CIA got involved because they wanted to know what this thing was. You know, had it just looked like a weird, you know, rotted old hull of a boat, they probably would have just passed it on to, you know, historians or the church, etc., and say, hey, you know, this is one for you. But they didn't do that because this looks sort of so modern, you know. I mean, it's obviously buried in the ice, which is suggesting to be there a long, long time. but it wasn't something like a bunch of old wood that had deteriorated or anything like that. And in the Pentagon, they don't call this object Noah's Ark, they call it the Ararat Anomaly. That's what it's actually officially called within the Pentagon. They refer to it as the Ararat Anomaly. And that's under the Freedom of Information Act, something like about 70 or 80 pages of documents have now surfaced. And one of the departments of the military that was looking into the story of whatever this thing was on Mount Ararat was an Air Force or military project called Project Moondust. And Project Moondust was basically, if you imagine, let's just say hypothetically, a Chinese spy satellite goes over the US, and it malfunctions, and let's say it crashes in an area of forest in Austin. Well, what would happen? Project Moondust was like a quick reaction military team that would go out and seal up the area, because Moondust, its whole mission was to sort of recover foreign technology for the US to analyse, to see, are they ahead of us, are they behind, are they at a similar level. So any way for the US to get their hands on foreign technology would be handled by this group called Moondust. So that would be the situation. If a satellite crashed in the woods, they would seal it off. They would bring in like a military transporter vehicle and load all the technology off, and it would be taken to the Air Force's Foreign Technology Division at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where it would be studied, to determine how good or bad or somewhere in between it was. So the very fact that this project, Moondust, was looking at the story of Noah's Ark is suggesting that they had their eyes set on the notion or the idea that Noah's Ark was some sort of highly advanced technological device, not just, as I said, a bunch of old rotting wood. And so we know Moondust were involved, we know the CIA were involved, and the CIA have sort of had a strange relationship to the story of the Ararat Anomaly, in the sense that they've said, well, yeah, we did take some photographs, we did actually sort of divert a spy satellite over there once, but we didn't really find anything, we just left it at that. But of the number of files, the small number of files that have surfaced through the Freedom of Information Act, one of them talks about how the CIA had standing orders that every time a new book was released on the subject, they would get a copy of it. That their personnel were ordered to get copies, which were housed in the library of the Scientific and Technological Intelligence Division of the CIA, which is called the S&T. And to give you one example, in 1975, there was a guy named Fernand Navarro who released a book on Noah's Ark. He was promoting it at a shopping mall in Washington, D.C. And one of the files actually talks about how people from the CIA Science and Technology Office went out to the shopping mall just in sort of plain clothes, t-shirt or open collar or whatever, and sat in the audience and listened to the lecture, and then prepared this sort of full report for the CIA as to what the latest findings were in his book. So, this kind of makes a mockery of the idea that the CIA wasn't really that interested. They're actually sending agents out to sit in the audience and, report back on who's saying what about the latest revelations on Noah's Ark. And again, like with the pyramids, something like Noah's Ark is not something you would imagine government personnel would be looking into unless there was another reason that goes beyond the sort of historical, biblical angle. And that would again seem to suggest, because Moondust were involved, they were looking at some sort of technology. One of the other guys that were closely watching in relation to this same story was a man named George Van Tassel. George Van Tassel was a very controversial character from the early years of the contactee movement. He claimed a lot of face-to-face encounters with very sort of human-looking aliens in the early 1950s and through the 60s. Now, George Van Tassel has his believers, as he has his detractors, and people are somewhere in between. But what was interesting is that the FBI and the National Security Agency had held massive files on Van Tassel. I got hold of the FBI, which is like this thick. You could prop that door open if it's that heavy, And the file basically contains evidence showing that pretty much every lecture Van Tassel gave, or conference I should say, where it was like a high-profile lecture, they were there listening and watching. And in pretty much all the lectures he gave after about 1956, he was speaking about how he believed that Noah's Ark, Noah's Ark was not like a huge ark full of animals. He believed it was like an alien ark, filled with the DNA, if you like, of animals. Now, you know, if you read and take literally the biblical account, you know, Noah supposedly took 2 by 2 animals onto the ark, you know, but if you think of the logistics of it, you know, how did he get 2 fully grown man-eating lions onto the ark, you know? I'd like to see somebody try that. I don't think that'd last very long, you know, so, or a tiger or 2 crocodiles. How do you travel the entire world before the flood's about to strike and get, you know, 2 of every animal from South America, then you zip across to Africa, then Australia, the North Pole, the polar bears and penguins or whatever, you know, it's not feasible, you know, to get 2 of every animal on the planet onto a boat would sink it, you know, because there are hundreds of thousands of different types of animals. But what's interesting is that most cultures around the world have flood legends attached to them, and they all have their own equivalent stories to Noah's Ark. Probably the most famous other one is Gilgamesh, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which talks about this, you know, god or the gods warning about a gigantic flood coming and picking a certain family or group of people to survive it. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, this giant ark comes to rest on a mountain in northern India. There's a Native American story about their gods telling them to build what they would describe as like magical canoes, which they would be populated with animals and they would survive. There's stories from England, where I'm originally from, you know, the gods coming down saying the planet's going to be decimated by a flood and picking certain people who are going to lead the way afterwards. So all cultures have these stories, they just put their own spin and interpretation on it, but it probably does suggest there were floods. But whereas the Bible talks about animals being taken on board, Gilgamesh talks about the essence of the animals being taken on board. Another one talks about the spirit of the animals, and this has been interpreted in a way that might make more sense. You know, it's kind of like, you know, like today, I mean, a woman who's trying to get pregnant, can't get pregnant, she has her eggs preserved, you know, stored, and in simple terms, frozen, if you like. Well, that's the idea that people were looking at, who the CIA was watching. The idea that maybe these arks were like gigantic alien space arks filled with sort of countless row after row after row of sort of preserved human and animal and terrestrial animal DNA, eggs, blood, etc., etc. And possibly, you know, did one of these crash on Mount Ararat and then provoke the legend of Noah's Ark with all these animals on board. Now, whether or not that's true, that's the sort of thing that George Van Tassel was talking about, this controversial contactee. And his references to this provoked a lot of interest, and these specific files were shared by the FBI with the CIA, the National Security Agency, the Air Force, where they even underlined all the stuff about Noah's Ark. So clearly there was somebody within that particular, or those particular agencies, where they'd obviously been talking about whatever this thing was on Mount Ararat and saying something like, hey, you know, anybody who talks about it, just send all the information on to us. And so, you know, although Van Tassel was a highly controversial person, you know, it's kind of ironic that the higher up people within sort of the most prestigious agencies of the US government were hanging on his every word as it related to the Noah's Ark story, which sort of goes down some interesting pathways. And we get kind of the same thing with Stonehenge in England, which of course, you know, isn't anywhere near as big as the pyramids. A lot of people don't realise actually how small Stonehenge is. You know, the major standing stones, the upright ones, are only like 18 feet high. You know, and the ones that sit atop them, you know, they're only sort of about 12 feet long. So it's actually not that big, really. But again, you have this issue of how was it built, and of course, as I mentioned with the pyramids, that there are these legends that Stonehenge was built by some sort of levitation. The stories about Merlin, the magician, who supposedly operated under King Arthur. There's a legend about him raising the stones to like magical music again, which sort of ties in with this acoustic levitation type thing that the military is developing. But what's interesting is that over the years, the British Ministry of Defence has taken a great deal of interest in the fact that there's been a lot of UFO sightings over Stonehenge. And many of these, in the last 20 years or so, have been what are known as the black flying triangle kind. I don't know if any of you have heard of the flying triangles. Well, you know, people think of UFOs, you think of flying saucers. But in the last sort of 20, 25 years, more and more people are reporting these huge black triangular shaped craft, which, you know, some people say, well, could there be a next generation military craft, like beyond the stealth bomber, that kind of thing, which isn't impossible, but when we look into it further, we see that what's actually happening is that there's more and more of these reports today, but they actually go back as long as UFOs have been seen. In the flying saucer variety, there were just less of them. So it's not so much that they've suddenly just appeared, they're just becoming more and more visible. But a lot of these sightings of these black flying triangles have been reported from Stonehenge. And Stonehenge is built on a piece of land called Salisbury Plain. And Salisbury Plain it's like a huge expanse of just fields and woods. But part of it is actually owned by the military. It's where they have sort of manoeuvres and operations, you know, and sort of test runs for going into warfare to train the troops. So it's off limits to the general public. It's like 27 square miles. It falls under government jurisdiction.
Right next to Stonehenge? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it's like behind where you have Stonehenge there, there's the main road, then you've got Stonehenge. It's all on what's called Salisbury Plain, but you go maybe a mile back and you just come to a big line of fence, and that's where it's all owned by the military. But the military's own personnel there have reported a lot of weird experiences that seem to be tied in with the stones. Wiltshire, where Stonehenge is found, is also home to what's called the Avebury stones, which is this huge stone circle. And both at Stonehenge and the Avebury stones, the people have reported these strange little balls of light sitting between the stones, which anywhere from sort of like a golf ball up to about a basketball size. But what's interesting is that people describe these these balls of light as almost like under intelligent control. That's to say, or they were some sort of an energy-based intelligence themselves, where people tried to get close to them, and the lights have sort of bobbed up and down, and then as they got even closer, they backed away, and then stopped, and then the person gets a bit closer, and they back a little bit further away. As if, you know, whereas we're sort of flesh and blood and bone, you know, could this be like an intelligent energy, if you like? And what's interesting is that these same balls of light have been seen over the crop circles, most of which appear in the same county every year, which is Wiltshire. And just a few years ago, the British Ministry of Defence released a report called the Condign Report, which addressed the idea of whether some UFOs at least could be, as they described them, as plasmas, sort of like strange balls of light. But the MOD wondered if these plasmas could actually have an effect on the human mind. And there's references in there to, if they could have an effect on the human mind, can we make a weapon out of it? You know, it comes back to the same thing. But again, all these weird balls of light were being seen around primarily Stonehenge and the Avebury stones. That was the Ministry of Defence's main focus. So again, it seems to be the same thing going on, whether it's Britain or America, that, you know, the interest in these ancient mysteries is provoked by, can we learn something from them that, you know, the military can use, rather than can we learn something that tells us more about our mysterious history as a species, which I guess from our perspective, we'd probably like to go with the latter. You know, for the military's perspective, it's more, you know, what can we do with it, you know, which is understandable. You know, I understand that, you know, they want to kind of improve their weaponry, I suppose. But, you know, we get this everywhere, where you have these ancient technologies and these ancient myths of the, you know, the people of that era having access to technologies that we've either lost or forgotten about. But and this is reflected in some of the files where they talk about the idea that, you know, if the pyramids were built by something like levitation or anti-gravity, they're not talking about some vast machinery, you know, and factories powering these things, because we'll probably find evidence. You know, we've got the pyramids, so if you know, we're talking about massive mechanized machines that were somehow powering it somehow, why wouldn't we find evidence of those as well? You know, arguably we should. So they were looking at the idea of whether or not ancient man possessed technologies or energies very different to ours, maybe even more like a mind-based, you know, like a psychic phenomenon, you know, actually using the power of the mind to lift stones, you know, in the same way that we would sort of just use your hands. You know, the idea was that they were looking at, you know, have we today developed technologically, but have we lost part of our the abilities of the human mind to actually perform fantastic tasks. And it's kind of like people who have visions of the future, or you think about someone you haven't spoke to for a while, and then they suddenly phone up 5 minutes later, that kind of thing. That's almost like a random use of these sort of latent psychic powers that I think all of us do have, but we've forgotten how to harness it on like a permanent, really sort of strong fashion. And that's one of the areas they were looking at, the idea that, well, maybe ancient man knew how to just switch that on just like that, and could apply it. So in other words, they were considering the possibilities that in the very, very distant past, there could have existed ways and means to build these that just didn't involve, sort of machinery and cranes or anything like that at all. And that wouldn't necessarily, there wouldn't be anything left because it was all being literally powered by the human mind. So again, but whether it's true or not, it's still fascinating that the Pentagon, would be sort of having round table think tank discussions on this particular theory. But for me, the most sort of fascinating aspect of all this related to a very ancient text called the Mahabharata. And the Mahabharata, for those who don't know what it is, it's a very ancient Indian text that's been suggested it goes back sort of 6,000 to 8,000 years BC, which is a long way. Even though our planet is billions of years old, in terms of the human race, when you start going back sort of 10,000 BC, it actually starts to get foggy even then. And then we're just down to simplistic stories of cavemen, and things like that. But then you have sort of this weird situation where it's so foggy that we go from cavemen to people building pyramids. It's like it changed almost overnight, where there should have been like a gradual process. It's one of the things a lot of people forget with the people in Egypt, the Egyptians, or whoever built the pyramids. There's some theories that maybe the Egyptians actually inherited them, moved into the area, and that we don't really know who built them. But if it was the Egyptians, they went from being sort of just hunter-gatherers to being able to move stones and build something like that. It's like we don't see evidence in history of a gradual process. Like with us, you have the Industrial Revolution, where you go from having the wheel and a horse and cart, and then you develop steam engines and propeller-driven aircraft, jet planes, spacecraft. We don't see that. They go from one thing to the next. So this has sort of given rise. Could there have been ancient civilizations that came before us that possibly we're seeing the remnants of, or some of their ancient history survived and was passed on to the next generation, and it got sort of distorted and lost in folklore. And this is sort of what relates to this book called the Mahabharata, this ancient Indian text. And it talks about a very ancient war in northern India. And as I said, there are ideas it could be 8,000 years old, 10,000. There are some rumours that the Mahabharata might be based on an even more ancient text. We could be talking about 30 or 40,000 years ago. And if that is the case, that would sort of blow away all the theories on when the human race really began to develop in terms of cities, writing, civilizations, culture, etc. But it's kind of like if we got destroyed tomorrow, what would be left of us 40,000 years time if it was like a really massive worldwide disaster? The people of that era would just say, oh, those stories that people came before us, it's just folklore. There was no such legendary place as America or whatever, it's just somebody wrote about it in an old folklore book and it got distorted and passed down. But the Mahabharata, imagine an ancient text, say written, 10, 20, 30, 40,000 years ago, and two rival factions going to war. You'd imagine sort of, guys on horseback, bows and arrows, spears, that kind of thing. Well, the Mahabharata actually talks about something totally different. It talks about these two opposing forces having these giant iron rods that they could unleash into the sky from the ground, and that would hit cities, and there'd be this blinding flash, and the entire city would just be decimated, flattened. They talk about the opposing armies, as I said, not on horseback with bows and arrows, but flying in the sky in these craft called vimanas. And when you read the translation, they actually talk about the vimanas being powered by an engine of mercury. Not even talk about being floated into the sky by balloons. And for all intents and purposes, when you read it, it sounds like a Top Gun type dogfight in the sky. And it also talks about these Vermaners unleashing these iron rods at the cities and just destroying them, you know, just nothing left at all. Also talks about this massive plume of smoke that would hang in the sky like 2 miles high for weeks, which, you know, kind of sounds like a mushroom cloud, you know, after an atomic bomb explosion. And the really interesting thing is it talked about how the people in the area, in the hours and the days and weeks afterwards, they would start to fall sick. The hair would fall out, the fingernails would fall out, they'd be vomiting, passing blood, and then they'd die. All those symptoms are classic symptoms of radiation poisoning. You know, it's kind of like today, I mean, you know, God forbid it ever happened, but if, you know, there was a nuclear war or a dirty bomb goes off, you know, it's not enough to say, well, the blast was on the other side of Austin, I'm okay. You know, if the wind blows, your windows are open and radioactive dust comes in and you breathe it in, you know, you don't have to breathe much in before, you know, you've got radiation poisoning and, you know, your white blood cell count goes out of control and, you know, you're dead in hours in some cases. That's one of the, you know, if you're not in the blast area, that's the major thing, is the radiation poisoning. But the Mahabharata, it actually sounds like it's describing all the effects of radiation poisoning or an atomic war from the, you know, this vast plume of smoke just hanging there for days, which sounds like the mushroom cloud. You know, the huge bright flash is the, you know, the flash of the explosion. They even talk about the temperature dropping and the sky turning black. And in scientists who research, you know, what would happen in an atomic war, they point out that because these explosions are so massive, they would kick billions of tons of dirt and dust into the sky, which would settle in the atmosphere and create what's called a nuclear winter, where the sun's ability to get through this thick, dense cloud, you know, the sun would, its ability to shine on the earth would be reduced by like 85%. You know, you imagine the temperature takes us down to, like, say, 25 degrees for 10 years until the clouds started to clear. That's what they're talking about. And again, the Mahabharata describes all this, which sounds like this nuclear winter. What's most intriguing is that one person more than any other who was fascinated and arguably obsessed by the Mahabharata was Dr. Robert Oppenheimer, who was the father behind the atomic bomb. He developed, I won't say single-handedly, but he basically ran the program that led to the creation of the 2 atomic bombs that were dropped on Japan to end the Second World War. And he was speaking at a conference in 1952 in Washington, D.C., and he was asked, you know, when were the first atomic bombs used? He said, and somebody said, you know, is it the ones we dropped on Japan? And he said, yes, it was. And then he paused and he said, in modern times, as if to say, you know, maybe we're the first, at least in our civilization, but not the first period. And he came to believe, although, you know, he was careful on what he worded it, and how he said it, he basically said, well, or came to the conclusion that we weren't the first, and maybe there were people like us who developed atomic energy in the past. But he didn't believe it was sort of like an entire worldwide civilization like ours, because, you know, even if we destroyed ourselves, there would still be a lot of devastation left, you know. And he came to believe it may have been sort of localized pockets where, you know, one nation was highly advanced, maybe like India or Egypt or some of the South American countries, whereas maybe, you know, whole swathes of Europe weren't, or China or whatever. Yeah, it's kind of like today, you know, we take things like the internet for granted, but there are still tribes in South America that, you know, hunt with bows and arrows. So, in other words, the idea that maybe in the distant past, when there weren't obviously nowhere near as many people on the planet, you know, could it have been the case that cultures flourished and destroyed themselves and then provoked legends like Atlantis, you know, and today we laugh at them, we say, oh, there's no such place as Atlantis. Well, maybe there wasn't by that name, but maybe it was sort of a distorted legend based around stories like this. And again, Atlantis and these ancient stories were studied deeply by the Pentagon. Another controversial character that looked into all this was a man named Edgar Cayce, who was a sort of prophet and psychic, and he came to believe that Atlantis, at least there was a basis of fact behind the legend. And the CIA actually opened a file on Cayce and all his Atlantis research. And there's even a rumour, which I haven't been able to prove, but it is in print, that supposedly the CIA infiltrated his headquarters, which is based in Virginia Beach, which still exists. You can go out to Cayce's sort of archives at Virginia Beach, but there's a story about the CIA managing to get somebody on the payroll there and report back, what all the files contain. So, we see a lot of evidence going in a lot of different directions as it relates to, what the Pentagon was interested in, everything from the pyramids to Stonehenge, to Morris Jessup and his anti-gravity research, to Noah's Ark, to the Avery Circle, the Avery Stones, and even to the Mahabharata and, ancient atomic warfare. And, I'll be the first to admit it's sort of an area that hasn't been explored that much before, the idea of what the government knows about sort of the ancient astronauts, ancient civilization angle. I wouldn't be surprised if more comes out in the same way that, 20 years ago, when files started to surface from the government on UFOs, more and more has come out over time. And I think that will probably happen as we go further ahead in this field. So that's sort of like a broad outline on at least what we know the government knows, or suspects at least. And I think it's probably fair to say that the government suspects more than it can actually prove. It's like sometimes we give governments more credit than they're due, in terms of their ability to find information. If we're talking about something that occurred 6,000 years ago, even they're going to have their limits on actually proving it versus theorising on it, which are two very, very different things. So I think they've got a lot of suspicions that the past isn't just as it appears to be, or the past isn't just, as black and white as the gods came down and Noah's Ark was this old boat. I think they have a lot of theorising and ideas, but maybe they're still scratching their heads, to a fairly significant degree. So, with that said, we'll go on from the pyramids to the world's weirdest places. That's a new book I've got out, which is a study of like 25 hotspots all around the world where strange things have occurred. Now, people say to me, well, how do you define, what a hotspot is? Can you define it? Well, a hotspot to me is, somebody sees a UFO, over Dallas tonight. That doesn't mean Dallas is weird. Well, I live in Dallas, and Dallas is weird. But I mean, joking aside, if somebody just sees a UFO flying over Dallas, the phenomenon that they've seen is weird, but the place isn't. But if you imagine you've got one place where people see UFOs, Bigfoot, ghostly activity, men in black, a whole range of different stuff, all concentrated on one area, then arguably that makes the place itself weird. And the one that I don't focus on in the book, because it's been done to death, is Point Pleasant, West Virginia, where in the 1960s you had a whole range of strange stuff that was chronicled by John Keel in his book The Mothman Prophecies, which was turned into a movie about 10 years ago. And Point Pleasant in West Virginia, just a normal everyday town until about 1965, when people began reporting this sort of glowing-eyed, winged, almost like a cross between a demon and a gargoyle type creature that became known as Mothman. And the name kind of sounds cartoonish, like Batman or Spider-Man. But the reports were sort of more like gothic and supernatural. It's like a shadowy, winged, wraith-like creature that would hide in the shadows and sort of have these penetrating, glowing red eyes, and people would almost see like the peripheral vision, if you like, sort of lurking in the darkness. And it became known as Mothman. Well, at the same time that people were seeing the Mothman, people who'd witnessed it started getting these visitations from the so-called Men in Black. People think of Men in Black, they think of Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones in the movies, but the real Men in Black are sort of very different. They're nothing like sort of government people. They're described as almost like creepy, sort of skinny, totally white-faced ghouls is probably the best way to describe them. They look like something, like imagine a modern day vampire, who wouldn't turn up in a cloak and dress like a waiter, in like some old horror film. They'd be like, imagine a vampire dressed in a modern day suit and it's like an old 50s fedora style gangster hat. That's how they turn up, and they're very menacing and creepy. So they were out in force at Point Pleasant. There was a lot of strange poltergeist activity in people's homes, people having alien encounters, UFO landings, and then it all suddenly came to a halt. But John Keel came to believe that Point Pleasant was what he termed a window area. That's to say that it was a place on the planet that seemed to be like a magnet for strange phenomena. And he came to believe there was a reason for this. He believed that there are certain spots on the Earth that are sort of like doorways and portals to other dimensions where paranormal or supernatural phenomena can come through. Best way to describe it, if you're driving in your car and you turn the radio on, you don't like the song, so you tune to another station, you tune to another, you tune to another. You tune to the fifth one, you find like a song you like, you leave that one on. Well, all those stations are all playing at the same time, but you can only be tuned into one at any given time. It's not like the others just don't suddenly exist or pop into existence when you retune. They're all there at the same time. And that's what Keel came to believe. That's like a simplistic description, but he believed that we sort of coexist in multi-dimensions, and things today like quantum physics are allowing for the existence of multi-dimensions, that if you knew how to sort of skip from one to the other, you could actually zip in and out of one reality and into the other. And that's what Keel came to believe was going on at Point Pleasant, that there was sort of like a rift in the sort of space-time area that allowed all this stuff to come through. So that's basically the theme of the book. It looks at sort of 25 hotspots around the world where a lot of strange stuff has happened. Now, we start with one that probably a lot of people can think of, Loch Ness, Scotland, which of course is sort of allegedly the home of sort of a creature that looks like that, sort of like a long-necked, long-tailed, thick-bodied, flippant animal that would become known as Nessie. Now, of course, people talk about the Loch Ness monster as if there's just one. There've been reports for at least more than 1,000 years. So, if there are strange creatures in Loch Ness, there wouldn't just be a Loch Ness monster swimming around for 1,000 years. It'd have to be like, a colony of them. And if there is, people say, well, what are they? Well, that is a picture or drawing of a creature known as a plesiosaur, which existed during the prehistoric era, the dinosaurs. Supposedly became extinct like 60-something million years ago. One of the theories is that because Loch Ness, before the last ice age, actually opened to the oceans, it wasn't landlocked like a large lake. Could some of these creatures have swum in, and then when the lake finally got landlocked, they couldn't get out, and they bred there and sort of acclimatised themselves to it. Well, it's not impossible, but the ocean's obviously a seawater, salt water. Loch Ness is freshwater. Now there are some animals which, there's like for example saltwater and freshwater crocodiles, and some animals can actually adapt. A lot of animals can't adapt at all. You put a sea freshwater fish into the ocean, it'll kill it. It's just it's like if we're in the sea, you get a mouthful of salt water, you know what it tastes like. It's that kind of that situation. So other people wondered, could they be giant eels, something like that. I guess if you're on the shores of Loch Ness and you see like a 30-foot long giant eel with a body the size of an oil drum, you're probably not going to argue whether or not it's a monster. It might be a giant eel, but it's for all intents and purposes it's a monster, I guess. Other people have suggested things like giant salamanders, giant sturgeon, catfish, all sorts of things, but that wouldn't explain the neck. And that sort of led to another theory, the idea that these creatures are paranormal, that they flit out of our reality, because although Loch Ness is a large body of water, it's like 22 miles long, a mile wide, and about 800 feet deep. Questions have been asked as to whether a creature like that, which typically grew to like 20 to 30 feet long, and of course, if they're living in Loch Ness, you would need a healthy, viably sized colony, so you'd have healthy reproduction, and is there enough fish in Loch Ness to feed like a colony of 30-foot long animals? That's going to require a lot of fish every day for every animal. And a lot of questions have been asked, maybe there isn't enough. Now there have been occasions where people have used sonar to scan the loch, kind of like the equivalent of radar in the sky. They've actually tracked the movements of one or two what seem to be large things under the water, but then they vanish in the same way that UFOs vanish off the radar screens. And this actually given rise, could these creatures be sort of passing through portals? And I don't think we can rule it out, because Loch Ness is legendary for a lot of other strange activity. Everybody thinks of the Loch Ness Monster, but back at the start of the 20th century, like 1908, 1909, one of the most famous occultists, Aleister Crowley, actually had a house on the shores of Loch Ness called Boleskine House, which in the 1970s was owned by Jimmy Page, the guitarist with Led Zeppelin. And in around about 1910, 1912, Crowley was supposedly involved in all sorts of ancient rituals and rites to try and summon up demons out of Loch Ness. There's been a lot of UFO activity over the Loch. People have reported seeing like huge black cats prowling the shore. Now, in Britain, there are no indigenous large big cats, like mountain lions or panthers or anything like that. But every year there are hundreds of reports of these sort of giant black cats roaming around, and many of them are seen at Loch Ness. There have been ghostly encounters at the Loch, and so in other words, there's sort of 5 or 6 additional weird things going on all the time at Loch Ness beyond just Nessing. And I think the strangest of all involved a man named Ted Holliday, who was a Loch Ness Monster researcher, who came to believe that the creature was paranormal. And this sort of developed from the fact that on a number of occasions, he was obsessed with it. He wasn't just interested, grew into like a full-blown obsession. And he would spend weeks at the shore of the Loch, waiting to see something to surface and photograph it. And on maybe 3 occasions out of 6 months, he thought he did see something. When he tried to photograph it, each occasion his camera would jam, or the picture would come out fogged. But on other occasions when he would test it, it wouldn't. It was almost like the phenomenon was taunting him, and then at the last moment preventing him from getting proof. And he came to believe that it wasn't a flesh and blood animal, or at least in the way we understand it. But in 1974, he had that kind of feeling that we all have on one occasion. When you think somebody's looking at you from behind, you turn around and somebody's staring right at you. You kind of get that feeling that somebody's doing that. And he had that one particular occasion, 74. He turned around and he saw one of these classic men in black, these pale-faced guys, in a black suit, of a lot less of all places, on the shore, which sounds bizarre. And the very next year, the same spot, because he used to take his sort of summer holidays from work and just go out there every year. He had almost like a fatal heart attack on the very spot where the man in black was seen the year previously. So that was sort of ominous in itself. But it goes to demonstrate that that when we look into some of these places where they're famous for a paranormal phenomenon, they're actually sort of saturated with a whole range of additional paranormal phenomena as well. That's a place I actually grew up only about 10 miles from in central England, called the Cayce, which is a large area of forest. And that particular cemetery there, which is a huge cemetery, that's just a part of it in that photograph. And the forest goes on for about 27 miles past there, and all around it as well, I should say. That cemetery is called the German Cemetery, which kind of might sound a strange name for a cemetery in Britain. But the reason it's called the German Cemetery is because when the Second World War was going on and German pilots were coming to Britain and bombing the country, there were guys on the ground with sort of artillery weapons firing upwards to bring the planes down, or British aircraft would be up there trying to knock them out of the sky. And if the planes crashed on British soil and the pilots survived or they parachuted out, they'd be taken to prisoner of war camps in Britain. In the same way that, like for example, the Vietnam War, when American troops were held prisoner in Vietnam, that same thing. And if any of the German soldiers or air crews or whatever died in Britain during the Second World War, they actually had a cemetery for them where they buried them all, and it's that one called the German Cemetery. But all around that cemetery for decades there have been sightings of strange activity. Interestingly enough, a lot of these sort of large black cats, which a number of researchers in the UK think have sort of paranormal origins as well. There have been reports also of sort of large glowing-eyed ghostly black dogs, which have become known as phantom black dogs in sort of paranormal research. And if any of you have ever read the Sherlock Holmes novel Hound of the Baskervilles, or seen the the movies. In the novel, it's based around this legend of this sort of huge, like almost like pony-sized black dog with these fiery, blazing red eyes that sort of prowls the countryside. It's sort of perceived as being like a Grim Reaper type creature. Well, Conan Doyle, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote the Sherlock Holmes novels, he actually based that story on existing stories of these phantom black dogs that have existed in British culture for centuries. And so he basically used the folklore and the mythology to write his novel. But the stories, you know, or the legends at least, have existed, as I said, for a very, very long time, and many of them are recorded around this particular cemetery. In 2007, there was probably the strangest series of encounters of all, where people reported seeing this large wolf-like animal sort of prowling among the headstones. Now, there shouldn't be any wild wolves in Britain at all. Officially, the last wild wolf in the British Isles was killed in Scotland in the 1700s. That's, you know, how long the wolf hasn't existed in Britain. But there have always been rumours about pockets of wolves, you know, surviving, which probably, you know, there could be some truth to that. That's not anything paranormal, you know. Nature does have a way of surviving. But what was weird about this particular wolf is that people said that as when they saw it, or it saw them looking at it, it would rear up onto two hind legs, almost like, so it looked like a werewolf rather than a wolf. And again, you know, Britain has a lot of weird stories of werewolves, not from the perspective like the Hollywood thing of, you know, some guy bursting out of his clothes, you know, like a Hulk or something, and turning into this sort of 8-foot tall werewolf, but creatures that sort of look wolf-like, but that can stand on their hind legs. Now, you know, it sounds kind of bizarre, but if you look into Native American lore over here, they have similar reports of creatures like skinwalkers, where a person can adopt the guise of an animal and become sort of allegedly, you know, morphed into it. Other people suggest, you know, the paranormal angle, and a lot of these creatures are seen around like cemeteries, ancient bridges, ancient crossroads, which are all classic areas of paranormal activity throughout the world. You know, bridges, it's like the trolls in Scandinavia, a lot of Bigfoot reports in the US reporting near bridges. You know, somebody's driving through the woods late at night and this hairy creature dashes across the road. It just happens to be on a stretch of bridge. You know, you have a lot of haunted bridges. With the Mothman stories at Point Pleasant in '67, it was all culminated in the collapse of the town's Silver Bridge, where dozens of people drowned when the cars fell into the Ohio River when the bridge collapsed. So for some reason, bridges, crossroads, cemeteries are all sort of interlinked with paranormal activity, and that's probably, in Britain at least, one of the sort of most paranormally soaked cemeteries you could find. And it's kind of funny, I grew up only like 10 miles from it, so it was like something I could check out pretty regularly. That's a place called Devil's Gate Dam in California, which is in Pasadena, so it's part of Los Angeles. And it's called Devil's Gate Dam. I don't think you can probably see it when I point it out, but that's supposedly like the horn of a devil. That's like its forehead, nose, eye, then you have the mouth, and then the chin there. It's sort of like supposedly like a side profile of a demonic type face. Excuse me. And so that's why it got locally it got this name, Devil's Gate Dam. But the dam itself, that particular area, that woodland, is again, it's sort of saturated by a lot of very, very strange stuff. You know, you'd imagine Los Angeles, Pasadena, sort of highly populated area. You know, how could there be somewhere mysterious like that? Well, when you actually get to the outskirts of Pasadena, where this is based, where I've taken that photograph, that's like at the bottom of a valley. And you probably have to walk downhill for like 10 minutes. So it's almost like a little hidden valley in Pasadena. And because of the way the wind blows and, you know, the ground, etc., when you're down there, it actually masks all the sound of the city. And it actually feels like, you know, you're in the middle of nowhere. And in reality, you're just, you know, you're very deep down in the middle of Pasadena. But it's heavily forested and wooded, and there are these hills and rivers. And, you know, it's kind of a spooky looking location. But in the 1930s, there was a man named Jack Parsons, who was an early rocket scientist, created there a company called the ERICH Corporation. And just before the space shuttle fleet was retired just a year or two ago, the Aerojet Corporation was still making the solid rocket boosters for the massive fuel tank that the space shuttle would use to get it into space. So, you know, his company had, you know, he was a major player in rocketry back in the 1930s, and of course, you know, 70 years later, his company was still going. And he was also responsible for, not single-handedly, but with a group of them, creating NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab. But he was also a noted occultist. He was a follower of Aleister Crowley, who just happened to have the house at Loch Ness. And he lived out at Pasadena, as I said, was a deep follower of Aleister Crowley. And before every rocket launch out there, he used to invoke the god Pan to try and ensure a successful flight. Now, at the time, all these rocket tests were being done on behalf of the military. The Army Air Force, it was combined at the time, called the US Army Air Force. And he had a top secret clearance with the military, and they just basically turned a blind eye to the fact that he also happened to be, you know, a practicing occultist and following Aleister Crowley. They were like, well, what he does in his spare time, you know, we don't really care as long as he can build rockets for us. But he would, you know, sort of engage in all these rituals and rites, you know, stamping around at the rocket launch site and down on bended knees, you know, speaking in archaic languages. You'd have all these generals there sort of stood there not too happy, but just get on with it, you know. And so, you know, he's an interesting character, but there's a lot of stories that because Parsons claimed to be opening doorways to bring in these ancient gods to ensure these sort of safe flights, there's theories, you know, did he open a door to something else, more negative, if you like? And what's interesting is that just behind those trees on the left-hand side, there's an old bridge. Again, you know, bridges coming into it again. That locally is known as Suicide Bridge. And the reason it's called that is because in the last century or so, I think the count now is like 130. In a century, like 130 people have just thrown themselves off the bridge. You know, and when research has been done by the police, you know, the people didn't seem like typical suicide victims, you know. Weren't major problems going on in their lives for most of them. Obviously some there were, but, you know, they just crossing the bridge and just threw themselves off, you know. And the theory that some people have is that the entire area, thanks to sort of Parsons, has sort of, you know, it's adapted or adopted this sort of atmosphere of negativity and some sort of psychic backlash, if you like, which provokes a lot of strange stuff. And the other thing that's sort of very unsettling, not from a paranormal perspective, but, you know, if there is this sort of negative thing in the area, in the 1950s, there was literally yards from where I took that photograph, there were a bunch of tragic killings of children by a man named Mac Ray Edwards, who was like a child serial killer. I mean, just totally deranged. He hung himself in prison, actually the day before Halloween in 1970. And, you know, it was, people have said, you know, is it the area? You know, was it something to do with that? We don't know, you know, that's kind of a more controversial, disturbing angle, but the fact that, you know, all these people killed themselves there, you know, Jack Parsons doing all these weird rites, and then you have this serial killer literally roaming this same area as well. A lot of people go there and they just feel this sense of something not being right about the area, you know, something they're not able to define properly. You know, kind of like sometimes people go to a house or a place and they just don't like it for some reason. And a lot of people get that out at Devil's Gate Dam. But what's even kind of stranger, you know, you'd imagine that today NASA or the government would want to distance themselves from Parsons, but they actually don't. Every Halloween, and I'm really not making this up, but every Halloween, NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab, which is just the other side of the dam, they have what's called Jack Parsons Day, where on Halloween they sort of pay homage to him, and they bring out these life-size mannequins, dummies, dressed as Parsons and all his colleagues, and they sort of toast him and to all the work he did. And they have this legend that the Jet Propulsion Lab actually stands for Jack Parsons Lives. You know, this is sort of the people who are sort of sending people into space and rockets into space, and they're sort of paying homage to Jack Parsons, you know, this occultist, and you know, kind of saying, it sounds strange because it actually is strange, you know. And even Parsons came to a violent end. He had a lab in his basement in his house in Pasadena in 1952. Actually blew himself up in the middle of an experiment. I mean, literally blew himself to pieces. And there was a rumour that he was trying to conjure up a creature known as a homunculus. Homunculus is like a, if you look it up on the internet, it's basically described like a small, little human-like figure with magical powers, which some people describe as, you know, like the little typical alien greys, because Parsons claimed to have opened a portal to bring flying saucers into our world in 1947 when the whole UFO wave first kicked off. He claimed that he opened the doorway and the saucers came through. So it's kind of weird that he would then be trying to conjure up this little figure in 52, and of course it all ended badly for him, and, you know, he got killed, and that was the end of Parsons, which, you know, some people say, well, you dabble into all this sort of stuff, you know, and then you pay the price for doing it, you know. So but it's a very weird set of circumstances when you find out what Parsons was doing all in this area, and then suddenly the entire area becomes just like a magnet for not just strange stuff, but very unsettling stuff. You know, it's one thing to see a big black cat at Loch Ness or Loch Ness Monster, but everything out there was just connected with death. You know, whether it's Parsons' death, the children's death, people throwing themselves off the bridge. You know, and the fact that we're not talking about an area of, you know, 2 square miles where you could say, well, stuff just happens, you know. No, we're talking about a concentrated little valley type area, and, you know, and nothing else. So that's probably one of the more unsettling, weird places as well. That's one that's a little bit lighter, but no less weird, which is Sedona, Arizona, where I actually got heat stroke for the first time when I moved over. I didn't realise how hot America could get, and stomping through the mountains, and didn't feel too good after an hour or so. It was like July and about 110, so I guess I should have known better, coming from rainy old England. So. But Sedona, those particular hills, the mountains there, they have a lot of rich history and folklore of so-called little people. You know, cultures all around the world have tales of goblins and gnomes and fairies and all that sort of thing. And, you know, when people think of fairies, you know, you think of these sort of little, sort of female-like things with tiny wings. That imagery was only created about 150 years ago in Victorian England. Before that, they were described as more sort of like 3 foot tall, not dissimilar to the so-called greys, you know, the alien greys today, like little figures that would come out at night and break into people's homes and steal babies and things like this, which is kind of like the alien hybrid stuff we hear today. But out at Sedona, we get a lot of very similar stories. The Native Americans of that area centuries ago believed that there were these sort of magical small creatures that lived deep below the mountains in these hollowed out areas, and if you knew how to get in there, you know, there would be these ancient sort of tribes that lived deep underground that only surfaced at night because their eyes couldn't tolerate daylight and things like that. There's also been a lot of UFO activity around Sedona, and a great deal of Bigfoot sightings as well. But what's interesting about the Bigfoot sightings is that, you know, a lot of people who study things like Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster, which collectively is called cryptozoology, you know, they take the view that these are just unknown animals that science hasn't found yet and nothing else. But a lot of the Bigfoot sightings out at Sedona, people have reported seeing these creatures, and then they've kind of just vanished. You know, I mean, literally as if they'd walked through almost like an invisible doorway. And again, this has given rise to the idea of these portal type scenarios, you know, flitting in and out of reality. And could Bigfoot be kind of like one of these interdimensional beings, if you like, that sort of flits in and out of our reality, which might explain why, you know, a creature that's like 8 foot tall, why it's been so difficult for us to catch one. You know, it's like we find, I mean, people say, well, most people never see a mountain lion, but we know they're out there. Well, yeah, most people don't ever see a mountain lion in the flesh, but we do have them in zoos. They do get hit by cars. You know, we do have evidence of them. But Bigfoot, the Yeti, the Abominable Snowman, all these, they're always kind of one step ahead of us or away from us. And it's almost to the point of where it's not just good luck, you know, they'd have to be the luckiest thing on the planet. Never, ever to get shot, never to get, you know, die in the woods, and just once, you know, a hunter stumble on them, you know, not asking for it to happen 100 times, because, you know, nature does take care of animals in the wild. You know, if say a deer just dies of old age in the woods, it doesn't last long because all the smaller animals eat it. You know, that's nature. But you would think just once, a 400 to 500 pound ape in a country as advanced as the United States, if there are entire tribes of them all across the country, we should get one, unless, you know, they're only here temporarily. And that's kind of borne out by the situation at Sedona, that they appear to be sort of window areas that these things come through, which, if that is true, then that might suggest they're not just apes. You know, I think it's our character as people to think that if an animal looks savage and hairy and got fangs, it's stupid. You know, what if they're highly intelligent and evolved, and, you know, they're only here part of the time, and probably with good sense, you know, I mean, who want to mix with us, you know, we probably, what would we do other than shoot it, you know, so, so those are the sort of things that are going on in Sedona, you know, some very different stuff, you know, bring Bigfoot into the mix. Roswell, New Mexico, you can see that's what's one of the street lights at Roswell. Welcome to Roswell. And Roswell's weird in itself because the street lights all have these sort of black eyes, black alien eyes painted on them to make it look like an alien head. So, you know, they've really sort of embraced the story of the crashed UFO. You know, that everybody knows, you know, you don't have to be interested in UFOs. Somebody says, what's Roswell? And I say, oh, that's the UFO place, you know. And, but again, people don't realise that there's a great deal of other strange stuff going on at Roswell as well. I'm sure all of you have heard the legends, and most of them are legends, but there was one story that was verified about these so-called alligators in the sewers in New York. Well, Roswell has its own equivalent of an alligator supposedly roaming the sewers of Roswell. How an alligator got into Roswell, we're not quite sure, but it has its own story. Now there are three old buildings. One's a courthouse, one's an old theatre, and the other one's a jail, where people have reported ghostly activity, sort of strange voices. And the courthouse was actually where, just after Roswell was set up in the 19th century, it actually had hangings there. And, you know, it's been suggested it's the ghosts of the people who were hung. So the town actually has a lot of ghostly activity attached to it. There's a famous orchard in town where there's a story of this sort of legless figure that sort of glides between the orchards, between the trees. So, you know, we have those two things beyond just the UFO encounter. But there's actually a very strange story that combines the UFO issue with the ghostly activity. And when the crash of whatever it was happened in summer of 1947, bodies were supposedly recovered, they were reportedly taken to the military hospital of the old Roswell Army Airfield. Well, the military base closed down years ago, and the same time as that, of course, the hospital did. And the hospital was eventually knocked down, and a new brick building was put in its place, which today is called the New Mexico Rehabilitation Center. It's basically, you know, for people who've got addictions and can't get past it themselves. So it's kind of like a rehab center. But it's actually built on the foundations of the old hospital where supposedly these bodies from the Roswell crash were taken. And a number of the nurses working there have quite openly and on the record, you know, with their names, have said they've seen these little characters sort of passing through the walls of the new building. And that's something we actually do get in a lot of ghostly stories, where ghosts seem to be tied to an area, and it's like they repetitively do the same thing over again. You know, they might walk through a wall, and then we find that 200 years ago, it was like an old castle, there used to be a doorway there, and it got bricked up. You know, but it's not as if they're like a living thing. It's almost like a tape loop playing over and over again, rather than like a living thing. But a lot of the nurses at the hospital have reported seeing these small figures sort of flitting through the walls late at night. And all this sort of stuff, you know, the ghostly activity, that never really gets reported to any great extent. I think because, understandably, it gets overshadowed, you know, by the UFO material. It's Death Valley, California, which is known for two things, or actually several things, but two I'll point out. One is so-called sailing stones. If you look at that on the right-hand side there, that's actually a stone. I don't know if you can see it there, Mark. There's like a line, slight line behind it. Well, the Death Valley is home to what are called the sailing stones, and basically they're stones anywhere from like the size of that chair upwards. You know, it's pretty big rocks and stones, and people, you can go out there and you can see these stones. They have like a trail behind them which goes on for miles, and they've actually moved across the desert floor. And nobody really knows how this is achieved, you know, how they make the way across the desert. You know, it sounds bizarre, but it's sort of joke or legend. You can go out there any time and see them. The weird thing is nobody's actually seen them in motion. They've only seen them sort of at a standstill with this huge trail behind them. In some cases, they've actually turned around like 180 degrees and sort of gone back the other way almost, you know. Didn't like that one, we'll try somewhere else, you know. So, and the most down-to-earth theory is because Death Valley is so hot, but it gets a lot of sudden out-of-the-blue rain. You know, if you imagine you've got like a really baked solid floor, and then the rain comes down and sits on it, so it's only just a slight thickness of rainwater. Well, they also get like these huge super winds that zip through the valley. One theory is, you know, could this sort of thin veneer of rainwater, you know, you get like a lack of friction, and it starts to slowly move the stone, and the wind gets behind it, and then because it's sailed on a slight amount of water, its own, I guess its own power pushes it along, you know, until it's like perhaps goes on a gradient like that, and then comes to a halt. That's not impossible. It's kind of an ingenious theory. The problem is some of these stones weigh like 200, 300 pounds, and it's been theorised that, you know, when people try to duplicate this, actually kicking, starting, moving a 200-pound stone, that's what no one's been able to achieve. You know, they've been able to push along a small stone, you know, like a wind turbine device behind it on a bit of water, but actually kick-starting something this high, you know, that's sort of 300 pounds, no one's been able to achieve that. And so, you know, it's given rise to the idea, could there be ancient energies under the ground that are somehow moving along those lines? That theory, like some sort of underground power or technology, is kind of made intriguing because a lot of rumours supposedly about ancient, the remains, if you like, of ancient civilizations deep under Death Valley. There are stories about Indiana Jones type people finding entrance points to sort of underground caverns and caves where they found sort of like Roman and Greek type architecture and archeological structures and massive amounts of gold and jewels, and you know, if you know where to go, you can, better than winning the lottery, I guess, you know. But some of these stories are certainly sort of folkloric, and there's no doubt about that. But it's interesting that they've surfaced, or the stories, you know, relate to somewhere underground, and we have these tales about these stones actually being moved, possibly by something underground. You know, could we be looking at like an ancient technology associated with whoever these early people were? That actual photograph was taken by, that's an official US government photograph taken by like the I think it's the US government geological survey it's called, and they've taken quite a deep interest in the so-called sailing stones. And if you go out there, you know, and you pick the right spots, you can see them all over the place at any time of the year. It's not even, you know, one type of year, part of the year when they appear, and others they don't. It's just totally at random. And a number of universities have gone out on expeditions, you know, to try and figure out what's going on. And they've come up with all these theories, but again, they've never been able to film them actually in motion. They've just always stumbled across almost as if the technology or whatever the energy is, you know, deliberately only moves the rocks when no one's around, which makes it even bizarrer.
Doesn't like crowds.
Yeah, doesn't like crowds. That's the Kremlin, Russia, which is basically like the Russian equivalent of the White House. And it's the home to the Russian Premier today, Vladimir Putin. Again, a lot of weird stuff at the Kremlin. Supposedly the ghosts of Lenin and Stalin, two of the more famous Russian leaders, have been seen wandering the corridors. There's also a crashed UFO story. Roswell, you know, certainly America's most famous crashed UFO story, but reportedly the Russians have got their hands on a number of crashed UFOs over the years, and one legend suggests that at least one of these craft was taken to like a deep bunker below the Kremlin. Now, we're not able to confirm that story, but we can say for sure that these bunkers do exist. It's like most countries around the world, you know, when the threat of nuclear war became realised, that they started building massive underground places to survive the attacks, you know, and start over again, where, or at least the government would be starting over again while we left to fry, I guess, upstairs. But so the Kremlin does have these bunker type areas. They do exist, and you know, had there been a nuclear war, from the Russians' perspective, that's where sort of their leaders and the government people would have gone, you know, sort of 300 feet underground in steel reinforced vaults, you know, with 3 months of water and food and whatever else. So, you know, the potential is there for the, you know, for the story to have some sort of truth to it. It's Halifax, Canada, which that actually shows the results of an explosion that occurred there in 1918, where two ships collided in the harbour. Worst case scenario, one of them actually had explosives on board, and it created almost like an atomic bomb explosion. It was one of the biggest natural, well, I say natural explosions, but disaster explosions in history. And thousands of people got killed in the town of Halifax. And ever since the explosion occurred, there have been reports of sort of ghostly encounters with, you know, some of the people who were killed in the harbour area of Halifax. But Halifax was also tied with another disaster. When the Titanic went down 6 years earlier in 1912 off Newfoundland, Halifax was the nearest big town where there were sort of ships and boats that would go out and try and help survivors, etc. But the ones they couldn't help, you know, they brought all the bodies back to Halifax, and they're actually stored at a mortuary in town, which today is a restaurant called the Five Fishermen. And a lot of these staff and customers at the Five Fishermen have talked about seeing ghosts in the restaurants, you know, literally dozens of them over the years. And then, of course, you realise, you know, 100 years before, it was the town's mortuary. And so Halifax has been tied to two tragic disasters with ghostly activity attached to them, but also the harbour. Back in the mid-1800s, there was like a whole rash of sea serpent sightings, you know, kind of like the Loch Ness monster, these long-necked creatures coming out of the water, and a lot of good quality UFO sightings over the town. Just a few years ago, the Canadian government released some of its files from the Canadian police, where they'd investigated sightings in and around the Halifax area. So this is sort of another example of another hotspot, if you like. And these are just sort of a few of the ones I touch on in the book. And I think, for me at least, you know, you can go anywhere in the world and find strange activity, but there are certain places where it's so dense and it's so many different things going on in one clearly small delineated area that I think we have to look at the place as much as we do at the phenomena that exists there. And I think, you know, however we define what a window area is, or a portal, or a paranormal doorway, I think that's what these things are. And maybe it explains why all these weird creatures like Bigfoot are so elusive. May also explain why UFOs, you know, people say, well, why are they coming from this star system to here, just to scare a few people and go home again? You know, maybe they're not. Maybe it is just the equivalent for them of, you know, jumping from one reality to another. Kind of like me stepping off here down to there. Literally as simple as that. And I think if we dig into this more, we might actually find a lot of the answers to whatever these things are. You know, we might be surprised to learn they actually live literally right next door to us, you know, but we don't know it for most of the time until somebody sees something weird and then it's gone again. So if anybody's got any questions about anything we've
Is the Bermuda Triangle in the book?
Yeah, the Bermuda Triangle's in there, yeah. I tried to mainly focus on ones that, like Halifax, that most people would know about. Or even if people know about Loch Ness, they don't know about all the other stuff apart from the monster. But there were a couple that, even though they'd been done a lot, you know, I thought I'd include, like the Bermuda Triangle. But yeah, I mean, that's a weird place.
And Topanga Canyon, California. Always Topanga Canyon, California.
No, I haven't got that in there. The publisher said, you know, don't don't sort of focus on just one state or whatever.
Oh,
you know,
yeah.
because people are going to say, what about my state? so there's like 4 from America, 2 from Britain, 1 from Russia, 1 from Japan, a couple from South America. So I tried to cover the planet and not leave anybody out if I could.
I seem to recall Ivan Sanderson, who was more of a cryptozoologist, but also looked at UFO phenomena. I seem to recall him plotting 2 like horizontal pearl necklaces, for lack of a better term, around the planet where he was saying he felt like there was a regular recurrence in these spots. And
Ivan Sanderson was sort of covered a lot of different areas of research, and he came to believe that these places weren't at random. It was sort of like connected with like the Earth's magnetism, that they seemed to be, you could plot them. They seemed to be like in lines around the world, and you know, maybe that would have something to do with it. You know, admittedly he didn't know how or why, but he saw a pattern where they seemed to be in line, or you know, in terms of actually, you know, plotting the coordinates, like map coordinates. Some of them seem to line up. So it doesn't necessarily tell us how or why or what it means, but it suggests, you know, that there might be some sort of contributing factor or whatever.
Did you go to all these 25?
I went to about 15 or 16.
Mount Shasta, did you go?
Yeah.
Did you feel something out there? At Mount Shasta?
Well, I did, but mainly I think because, for me at least, it was because I knew it was sort of a magical place. You know, I think that came into it more. But the other places I didn't go to, I specifically chose ones where, like, friends of mine who do similar research had been. Like, for example, I've got a chapter on the Caucasus Mountains in Russia, where there's like Bigfoot reports and vampire stories and all different stuff. And a friend of mine, Richard Freeman, he went out there on an expedition about 2 years ago, so I interviewed Richard and got all his information, because, you know, I couldn't get out to that one. And he also went to Guyana, which is like, there's a part in the jungles of Guyana, which is like Jurassic Park. You know, people talk about seeing these giant lizards and these large flying winged animals like pterodactyls, and he went out there. Look, that's Richard's big thing. He liked, you know, strange creatures, and so he did that one, and then so I interviewed him for that. So, you know, I always feel that if you're going to write about somewhere, you know, it's why the internet's great resource material. You know, there's never any better thing to do than actually go out and check the areas out. And if you can't do it, at least, you know somebody who has. You know.
Yeah, he was talking about Ivan Sanderson, and I think there was something about the idea that there was an icosahedron overlaid on the planet in some kind of ley line-like formation. But I was wondering, have you tried to use maybe his material and Bruce Cathy's material? Because supposedly Cathy came out with a program that is a computer program which you can actually plot where these ley lines intersect, and I was wondering if you had thought about maybe using that in order to track down some of the weirder aspects.
I have some research. Ley lines are basically sort of these, I won't even say theoretical, you know, they're probably just not really very well understood, you know, energy lines that supposedly crisscross the planet. And again, in Britain, where I'm originally from, you know, you can find places where stone circles, you can plot a straight line where there's, say, a stone circle from 3,000 years ago, and there's an ancient church from 800 years ago and something else, and they all line up as if ancient man knew something about these energy lines and built sacred sites on them. And like Bruce Cathy, who was a New Zealand researcher who's written a number of books on things like UFOs and pyramids and levitation, he came to believe that these sort of energy lines, you know, UFOs would travel along them, maybe these sort of stone blocks were moved along them. But also the idea that, you know, it's sort of like natural lines of energy around the Earth. Now, I've not sort of delved into the idea that they could potentially be opened, as, you know, to other areas. But I mean, you know, when you talk about energy lines around the Earth, you know, maybe there is a tie in there somewhere.
Well, in terms of, like, I think one of them intersects at in Africa, right there. I think it's, I want to say the Ivory Coast, around where they used to see stuff like Magellan Bimbich.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, you do find that, you know, often sacred sites have a lot of weird stuff attached to them, or people see strange things. You know? So I think there's something to be said. You know, that ancient man knew something about sort of magical areas. You know, people say, well, why did they build this here? Why is Stonehenge there? Maybe it wasn't built there because it's convenient. Maybe it was the area that they're sort of paying homage to. You know, but they knew it was a magical area, so they kind of built something in response to it in that place, perhaps. You know.
I just wondered, in your looking at the Freedom of Information Act stuff from the Pentagon, if you'd ever gotten a sense of whether they've succeeded getting information from the pyramids, or they're just doing
Well, I mean, certainly there are a lot of rumours, which I can't say we can prove that they did it, but in the 50s, a lot of sort of aircraft magazines, you know, newsstand magazines, were talking about how they got insider sources in the Pentagon saying that the government was researching anti-gravity. And there's actually a famous story that, I don't know why, but this one really got picked up on the internet. It was titled something like "Welcome to the Gravity Engines." And you can find it online, you know, the original. It's like from something like Reader's Digest or something like that. And it talks about, you know, the military back then researching anti-gravity and levitation. And there's pretty good evidence that they were looking at it. But the problem is, of course, you know, it's like anything really alternative gets developed, it just has a stamp of secrecy put on it. You know, that's why I think we've only got a certain number of these files. We've got the early files where they're doing research. You know, if they've achieved it, you know, that's just going to get buried. And if anything's going to serve, it's going to be by accident. You know, somebody declassifies something by mistake or whatever.
You know, I've often wondered why is NASA still pissing away billions on rockets?
Yeah.
We might have the technology.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, I think part of the answer to that, you know, for people who didn't hear, is why is NASA still building like rocket engines if it's got anti-gravity? Well, often government agencies don't always share with each other, you know, what they've got. You know, you think that the military or the government is one unified body, but often agencies just don't know what each other's doing. They jealously guard their stuff. And of course, you know, you've got the economic angle. You know, you introduce a technology that gets rid of the need for engines overnight, you're going to bankrupt the Middle East in 24 hours if there's no more need for oil, which you look how unstable the Middle East is now. You imagine that every country in that area bankrupt if we don't want your oil anymore because we don't need it. You know, it could actually not just affect the economy, but put the world on, you know, the edge, so to speak. So I think a lot of this sort of alternative stuff is looked at by people in government, not just from the perspective of the technology, but what happens if we change the planet by introducing it. You know, we would love it if, you know, unlimited energy, no electric bills, no water bills, you know, make all our lives much easier. You got free energy, but there are a lot of things from the government's perspective that, you know, throw things into chaos, you know.
How would they tax it?
How would they tax it? They find a way. You know.
Do you think you'll ever do a book on the secret space program?
I'm not sure. The question was, do I think there's a secret space program that, you know, sort of running alongside the official one of NASA? Well, you know, it depends how you look at it. I mean, if you go back and look at the newspapers from 1969 when Neil Armstrong first walked on the moon, the stories were, you know, 20 years from now we'll have bases on the moon, you know, there'll be hotels, you'll be able, you know, be able to go on holiday to the moon or whatever. And even if it didn't go to that point, you know, there were stories about how it would be actually quite feasible to build like an outpost on the moon, kind of like the equivalent of a North Pole outpost, that kind of thing. Now, of course, today, you know, there is no more manned space program for NASA. You know, it's like, ironically, but it's true, you know, if America today wants to send a man into space because the space shuttle program's being cancelled. They have to ask the Russians, you know, will you send one of our guys up on your next mission? You know, the Russians love to reply, well, we'll think about it, we'll get back to you, you know, just let them steam for 24 hours, you know. And they always say yes, but it's like, you can tell that they feel good. But unfortunately, you know, that's where things are at. There is no manned space program.
Doesn't NASA have the X-34s? I mean, those really small space shuttles?
Well, they do, but I mean, for all intents and purposes of actually achieving anything meaningful.
They don't tell you.
No, but I mean, you know, you can look at it two ways. Well, the economy's going downhill. Maybe people have been thinking, let's focus on getting things right here, and the space program we can go back to. But on the other hand, you have people who say, well, the reason the government's not worried about scaling back NASA is because there's more like a militarized space program that runs in tandem with the official one, but that maybe even people in NASA don't know about. I mean, there are a few things you could argue in favour of that. For example, through the Freedom of Information Act, again, just a few years ago, documents surfaced on something called Project Horizon, which was a US Army program, actually set up in 1959 to build a base on the moon. And this was going to be like a totally classified military program, nothing to do with scientific discoveries or advancing knowledge of, you know, the mysteries of space. It was basically, in the event of a war with the Russians, if in a worst case scenario, Russia launched a sneak attack and America couldn't get its missiles back in the air in time, and America got destroyed, literally flattened, before they could, you know, retaliate. If they had an outpost on the moon with, you know, dozens and dozens of nuclear weapons, you know, they could be launched from the moon down to the Earth at the Soviet Union and, you know, take the Russians out, even if America had got taken out as well. So the Army had this plan, Project Horizon, as far back as '59 to build an outpost on the moon. They didn't even, when NASA was formed in 1959-60, they didn't know anything about it. They didn't even know anything about Project Horizon in the 60s. And it only came out when somebody in the Army consulted somebody in NASA about this plan, and they're like, oh, thanks for telling us, guys, you know. So in other words, the military could have kept these programs entirely secret. This is 45, 50 years ago almost. So, you know, the notion that there is a secret space program isn't impossible, but if it does exist, it would have to use technology far in advance than current space technology. The reason being, you know, so when the space shuttle took off, everybody saw it, you know, because it had this huge fuel tank. And that's what, when the space shuttle exploded in '86, you know, and killed all the astronauts, the main reason they died, because they're basically sitting inside a gigantic fuel tank, because that's how much fuel it takes to boost and force the rocket up into space. So, in other words, you can see the space shuttle taking off from 50 miles away, because you've got this huge, expansive amount of explosives, you know, just propellant just going into the sky. So, if there was a secret space program today with rockets going to space, everybody would be seeing them taking off, thinking, what the hell's that? So it would have to be using a technology that isn't rocket-based and probably be going into the sky at night, you know, from a military base and painted black or whatever, so no one would see it. So I don't rule that out, you know, because of the history of the fact that the military has been doing space-based programs. It's proving it, but, you know, I don't rule it out. You had a question?
So all of the libraries, you know, in the past, ancient history that have been destroyed, has the government ever gone back and actively looked to try to find, you know, if there's any repositories of information that might...
Yeah, like old archives and things like that. Yeah, well, actually, probably the best, most recent example is with the war on Iraq. When the troops went into Iraq, one of the places that became the focal point was the Baghdad Museum, which contains literally thousands of examples of very ancient Middle Eastern treasure, ancient manuscripts, sort of writing on old, you know, papyrus and stones and things like that. And it got looted massively. Now, one of the theories was, well, you know, the looting was just done by people who, you know, they'd lost their homes or whatever, so they stole something, they'd sell it to an archaeologist to get money for food or whatever. But there was actually a study done by an arm of the US Army which found that the basement area of the Baghdad Museum, it looked like that some of the staff had been bribed to actually allow people in there, and the basement part was targeted and just emptied. And a lot of that material was never seen again. And a substantial amount of it reportedly related to sort of very ancient Middle Eastern stories of sort of, you know, the gods coming down, fantastic technologies. And the theory is that, you know, it was basically the looting was a cover to get this material out of Iraq and try and research it, you know, to determine...
War was a cover, you mean?
Well, not the war itself, but it was a convenient, it was in the right place at the right time to allow something else to go on.
And the surrounding of the ziggurat at Ur.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, there's a story, for example, about the so-called Anunnaki, you know, coming down the Middle East thousands of years ago, which were perceived as being gods, but some people said ancient extraterrestrials, and linking them directly with Iraq, and actions there, and all this sort of secrets and legends they shared, and material being taken to the Baghdad Museum, and then bunches of it vanishes, etc. So that's probably the most recent perfect example. But there are also a lot of stories. In fact, the one I didn't mention about the Noah's Ark is that a number of years ago, stories began to surface that supposedly certain artifacts found on Mount Ararat were brought into the Smithsonian and basically were held there for a while, and that the staff were told, well, yeah, it was taken from Mount Ararat, we think it could be something to do with Noah's Ark, but don't talk about it. And then it was basically crated up and shipped out, kind of like the final scenes in Raiders of the Lost Ark, where they take the Ark of the Covenant into this big vault type area and just store it away because they don't know what to do with it. So we have stories like that with the Smithsonian Noah's Ark, and a guy named David Duckworth, who worked there in the late 60s, he was one of the people who went public with his story, and his story was actually published in a book in 1982, and he said he saw this material and was told about it when he was at the Smithsonian in the late 60s, and he said that after he told his story it was published, 2 FBI agents came out, and he said they didn't exactly threaten me, but they just said, be a good idea if you don't talk about it, so which I guess it's a moot point whether or not that's a threat. So that's at least 2 examples I can think of, where you have got either an ancient museum or a prestigious modern day museum containing ancient artifacts that seem to be somehow tied in with all this sort of secrecy.
Yes, I got a question. There was a book that came out, I think it was called, it wasn't Jim Keith's book, but it was about suppressed conventions.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a story, supposedly, that came out around the turn of the 20th century in the Phoenix Gazette, I want to say about 1906, about Egyptian artifacts being found in the Grand Canyon area. Were you ever able to follow up on that case and determine, because supposedly they cordoned off the area and they won't let anybody get at it, but were you ever able to maybe file some FOIA requests and actually...
I actually don't know that story, so...
Okay, well, like I said, a small newspaper basically did a story at the turn of the 20th century, I want to say about 1906, 1907, in which they described how there was Egyptian artifacts found at the at the bottom of the Grand Canyon at a certain point. At a certain, obviously, the area that they found it at, these various caves and all that kind of stuff, I think there was hieroglyphics and stuff like that. They cordoned it off, so you couldn't get at it. And anybody that tried to, maybe take a donkey down there, got, get buzzed by black helicopters. I'm assuming that they've already wiped it clean, but I would just like to see.
You're talking about the time when they found it, it was all cordoned up.
Well, but that if I'm talking about now, obviously you're probably not going to find much there. But at the time, there was a story that came out, and this was put in this book, and that's where I read about it.
I don't know that story, unfortunately, but I mean there are a lot like that, where there's been a lot of secrecy attached. For example, the story about the Sphinx in Egypt that's supposedly under the left paw. There's supposedly some hidden chamber, and when sort of like the equivalent of sonar, radar, has been tested, it does seem to show that there could be like a hollowed out area under there, and the stories about ancient records being stored there that go far beyond the Egyptians that tell of a very earlier, massively superior civilization. And the Egyptian governments have gone really out of the way to come up with every reason you can think of as to why that area shouldn't be excavated. And that's not rumour, that's fact. They've come up with reasons why, well, maybe one day, but not right now, we just don't want to disturb that area. So you get a lot like that.
I was just going to add, you talked to Walter Bosley, he knows about the Grand Canyon Egyptian stuff.
Oh, okay, Walter Bosley, Walter's an author.
And I think part of the story involves the Smithsonian again, like somehow they ended up with some of the materials.
Right. I was going to ask you about that as well.
Well, there's a lot of weird stories about the Smithsonian. There was one story about how supposedly they had the remains of a mammoth, this huge mammoth, the idea is that they live longer than we think in wilder Siberia, and that supposedly somebody found and killed one, and they hid it because they didn't want to upset the historical, situation of well, science tells us they became extinct then. You know, they didn't want to ridicule the scientists of the era, so they destroyed the body or whatever. There's lots of stories like that with the Smithsonian. I mean, a lot could be folklore, but you know, when you have people speaking on the record, and we can prove that, you know, that they have had ties, you know, with government agencies. I mean, a lot of people don't realise, for example, that museums often acquire ancient artifacts as a result of war, so they're provided by military agencies. You know, it's a lot of people don't think that. It's like, for example, during the Second World War, the Nazis. You know, people say, well, how did they get so big and powerful? Well, they looted. One thing that they looted, like ancient castles all across Europe, plundered them for gold, ancient paintings, architecture, statues, and used that as like collateral. You know, to bribe people in these towns and whatever to get a foothold there. And eventually a lot of this made it, after the end of the Second World War, to the Vatican. You know, it was secretly handed over to the Vatican for safekeeping, and they deny it because, you know, it implicates a link with the Nazis. But I mean, you know, you get a lot of that where you know, weaponry, artifacts come as a result of you know, war. I mean, as a classic example, I mean, it's on a very different level. My granddad on the dad's side was in the British Army in Egypt, and he I probably shouldn't say this, but he chipped a piece of one of the rock off one of the pyramids and brought it back. So my dad owns it now. It's like a bit of pyramids this big. So he was out there in Egypt for a while, and
like the Egyptian Berlin Wall. Huh?
Yeah, like the Egyptian Berlin Wall. Yeah.
I was going to ask you about, have you found any government documents relating to CIA, DIA, FBI's liaison with the Smithsonian in order to cover up a race of giants that supposedly there had been bones that found, went to the Smithsonian, has never found them?
I've never come across any records on that. I mean, I know the stories about, you know, when they've supposedly found them out in California desert, in, you know, underground caverns, you know, these giant bodies, but I've never looked into it in terms of freedom of information or anything. But, you know, I mean, if you look into the Freedom of Information Act, there's some really weird stuff that's surfaced over the years. It wouldn't surprise me. I mean, one file that I got, which was a very strange one, was a US Army file from the 50s where the Army was trying to determine if dogs possessed ESP, if they possessed psychic powers. You know, and the reason why was they wanted to train dogs to use ESP to find minefields of bombs. You know, could dogs actually find mines buried under the ground? You know, by using psychic powers. You know, just release them on the battlefield, and they gave it up because somebody said, well, how do you know they're not just finding them by scent? You know, and so do we really need to be spending X number of dollars to find them, see if they've got psychic powers? But the Army for like 2 years spent something like $50,000 a year, which is a lot of money back in like 1955, to determine if dogs could use psychic powers to find landmines. That's a really weird file. The strangest one, without doubt, that I found was a CIA file titled Acoustic Kitty, which it's a very strange file, and it's not very nice for the creature involved. But it involved the CIA getting hold of a cat, and they inserted a radio antenna in its tail, and like a microphone inserted into its neck, and they tried to train it to walk into the grounds of the Russian embassy, and it would, like, you know, walk past people and just pick up fragments of conversation with Russian people standing outside the embassy, you know, and then they'd have guys with the headphones on in the van outside translating what, you know, the guys stood outside the Russian embassy were talking about. Well, that was the plan, but on the very first occasion they tried it, they let the cat out the back doors of the van. He got run over by a truck. So that was that. And they thought, well, that's got to be a sign, you know, that we're probably not worth pursuing, and they gave up on it. But the problem was, they thought eventually it wouldn't work anyway, because there'd be massive rejection issues, you know, with implanting some huge piece of metal into poor cat's neck and tail, you know, it probably wouldn't live long anyway. But government agencies do a lot of weird stuff like that, where they'll just funnel, you know, 50 grand here and there into some totally crackpot project that, you know, probably doesn't stand a chance in hell of ever really working. So.
I'd never heard of acoustic levitation.
Acoustic levitation?
And the Army studying that or something?
Yeah, it's basically, where you know, if you like you're at a rock concert and you feel the sound hitting you, well, you can actually have what's very concentrated acoustic energy. That's to say, like high or low level sound waves, and they basically, you can direct them. You can literally sort of direct it in one sort of very clearly defined area. And if you have these opposing acoustic direct energy lines, it creates something between them which is known as a resonance zone. So you have these two, it's basically, if you have a magnet, you know, you've got two opposite polar sides of a magnet, you try and push it together, you get them this close and you can feel them pushing away from each other. It's like that. Well, if you push them close enough together, you know, you reach that point where your hands kind of start shaking because, you know, they're really forcing against each other. It's kind of like that. And you create what's called a resonance zone. That's what it's officially termed. And the military's had some success in raising small objects within this resonant acoustic zone because they're basically held in place by the acoustic wave pushing from either direction. And granted, they haven't had much success with anything large, like, you know, a 2-ton stone or whatever, but that's what they're talking about. And it's interesting that, you know, as I mentioned earlier, that a lot of the legends from Egypt, South America, Central America, they all talk about the stones, these, you know, 20, 30-ton stones, being moved to like the sound of a magical musical instrument. The Incas have a story about one of their buildings being built by this little dwarf-like creature that would play a flute, and they would raise into the air. The similar ones come from Stonehenge. So basically, they're all talking about stones being moved via sound, but they've been distorted over the years to things like magical music or like a, you know, magical guitar or something like that. But if you look at it in that terminology, literally, you know, it doesn't make sense. But if you look at it from the sense they're talking about sound, it's very similar to what today's military is doing, as if ancient man, you know, developed it. It's kind of like this, if any of you have ever heard of it, Coral Castle in Florida. It's this weird place where you can go to where this one guy, pretty much alone, moved all these massive stones, and he would never reveal the secret of how he did it. And if you look it up on the internet, it's a really interesting story.
Where in Florida is it?
Do you know exactly where it is?
Coral Castle.
Yeah, it's called Coral Castle.
Homestead, Florida?
Homestead, is it? It's called Coral Castle, and you can see all the pictures of all these massive stones. You know, people would arrive there the next day as friends, and another big stone had been moved, you know, 30 feet, and he would never tell anyone how he did it, but there were rumours that it was somehow connected with sound. So.
What's good? Where's your next conference appearance?
In Minneapolis. It's on the weekend of October the 19th. It's called the Paradigm Conference. And it's actually a good one. There's Eric von Däniken, who's got the earliest ancient astronaut researcher. He's going to be there. And Marie Jones. Marie's actually a good friend of mine. She wrote a book all about, that contains all this information about the acoustic technology. I forget what it's called now, but she wrote a book all about that. She's going to be speaking there. And it's actually like a 4-day event. It's Thursday, Friday, Saturday and Sunday. And but it's basically over the weekend of the 19th of October.
What's your next book going to be about? What are you working on?
I've got, well, my other big interest, which is cryptozoology, which is the study of unknown animals. I sort of write those in like a road trip style, you know, when I go on the investigations. And so the new book I've got coming out around about the end of the year, it's called Monster Diary, and it's like a write-up of the last 3 years' worth of on-the-road stuff, going looking for Bigfoot and lake monsters and all that good stuff.
Thank you all, and of course he's got books for sale over here, so please help him out, and we'll be passing the plate around. Any donations you can give are greatly appreciated. Thanks for coming.
How much do those cost?